Sharing time with Deputy Broughan. I'm taking 10 minutes, Deputy Broughan 5 and Deputy Wallace 5.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to begin by acknowledging, by applauding and thanking those individuals, families, organisations, communities and activists who continue to work for animal welfare, who work to expose the cruelty and the neglect that goes on in this country in relation to animals. And yes, there are positive measures in the Animal Welfare Bill, but we would not be having the debate tonight if that Act were working and all the measures were being implemented. So if we look at the facts, the National Animal Cruelty Helpline that was set up records over 53,000 calls in the first 3 years, with more than 16,500 this year, in the past year, including a range of animal issues, from neglect to health issues with chronic skin conditions, inflammation, untreated illnesses like cancer, living in appalling conditions with no access to food or water, being found in emaciated conditions. And these are cases that are coming from many counties in Ireland. Now, the ISPCA, they care for all animals, companion, wild, farm and animals used in entertainment, sport and research. But they have 8 uniformed inspectors covering 17 counties. So how serious are we about animal welfare with only 8? 8 cannot even cover what is in the legislation, so I believe we're paying lip service to animal welfare. However, those inspectors did initiate over 70 prosecutions, with 30 finalised in court. But even though the Animal Welfare Act allows for significant fines and imprisonment, the penalties imposed by the court are all at the lower level of the range and consequently derisory, and I think that speaks for itself. Now, to look at some particular examples, in a topical issue last year, I highlighted the matter of the abuse in puppy farms, and I gave the details in breach of the existing Dog Breeding Establishment Act. There were no upward limits, inspections were appointment with several weeks' notice. When improvement notices were given, the premises are invited to comply. A puppy farm passed by the local authority but had multiples of the permitted number of dogs, and those dogs living in absolute squalor. We have county managers being compelled into initiating enforcement procedures. So we don't see any urgency in ensuring improvements are carried out, and in the meantime, the animals continue to live in appalling conditions. A vet in a certain county inspected an unregistered dog breeding establishment, found the dogs in unacceptable conditions. They were seized. He recommended the owner be prosecuted, which did happen, and he was convicted. But while that case was pending, the same owner applied for a dog breeding licence, got it because the same vet granted the licence. He could have waited on the outcome. There's another example where an improvement notice was given to a facility. The enforcement was not followed up, and the facility took 2 years to comply, and the animals continued to live in those appalling conditions. I also highlighted the puppy farm in County Cavan, which was the subject of a documentary and which showed appalling abuse. And because the ISPCA were critical of Cavan County Council, we have the officials there and in Leitrim County Council asking that the ISPCA refrain from directly criticising them. Now, the ISPCA were working to ensure that the councils were enforcing the Dog Breeding Establishment Act and applying the existing guidelines. Another council had licensed a breeder for 300 dogs, despite that breeder not having appropriate facilities or planning permission. So surely the local authorities, the department, the vets and the Veterinary Council of Ireland should be on the same page as the ISPCA when it comes to animal welfare. Now, Minister English's reply that night, and I quote, was that the scope of existing guidelines needs to be enhanced as they are quite benign, representing a minimal standard that's no longer acceptable, particularly in view of recent issues that arose with some establishments. So a review of the guidelines for dog breeding establishments would begin. Now, in reply to a PQ question from Deputy Clare Daly and myself last June, Minister English said the public consultation process closed on the 1st of February 2017. He expected the findings in June 2017, and they would be considered without delay. This is October, and where are they? And I hope when the guidelines do come out that the next issue will be completely covered, and that's the disposal of dog waste. There are at least 73 registered puppy farms, so at least 30,000 dogs being produced yearly, and that's a lot of dog waste. Dog waste is linked with a number of diseases, and it's a serious threat to the environment, to the health and to livestock if it's not properly disposed of. The Food Safety Authority has various rules and guidelines about untreated organic material on an agricultural farm or agricultural land, but they need to look at the dog breeding establishments as well. Now, a very detailed submission on this is in with An Bord Pleanála on a particular planning application for a particular puppy farm, which had already been permitted by the local authority. So obviously the local authority are not paying much attention to the health issues of dog waste and EU directives on this. And then we come to the hares, and it's a total contradiction that under the Wildlife Act the hare is protected, but yet the Act also allows hare coursing, which we know is terrorising one animal by another. It's unnecessary cruelty from the netting process, the transportation of the hares, the handling of the hares, keeping them herded, and of course then the practice of blooding. And then we come to coursing trials, which are not administered by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, but they did attend a recent coursing trial, and they found the coursing club there planned to hold between 130 and 150 trials using 64 hares. Now the hares are only supposed to be coursed once a day, and then they are released, so the maths do not add up there. Now, I prefer to see an end to live hare coursing because there is an alternative, but in the meantime there is a need for the coursing trials to be monitored. The National Parks and Wildlife Service, they should be informed of the location, the dates and the times, and if they don't have enough personnel to monitor them, then they should be banned. We believe also there is a strong lobby at the Minister at the moment to drop the condition that a hare would only be coursed once a day, and condition 20 of the licence to net hares is also not being complied with, namely that each single surviving hare is earmarked with a non-toxic dye, because we're reliably informed a certain hare trapper who goes to the release site to capture the hares just released and then goes around selling these hares to coursing clubs, and another hare trapper who keeps a supply of hares at his establishment to sell on to coursing clubs who might be short of hares. And then the other contradiction is greyhound owners, including those who are against coursing, have to register with the Irish Coursing Club if they want their greyhounds to take part in track racing. The Coursing Club is over 90% financed by the registration fees, but the majority of greyhounds don't take part in coursing, and the greyhound industry and greyhound welfare could do with some of that funding. Greyhounds can live for up to 14 years, but yet the lifespan for Irish greyhounds is 3 to 4 years. So thousands are put to sleep yearly, including at racetracks where sometimes injuries are not treated. We have cases of greyhounds being dumped with their ears burned to remove the markings which could identify the owner. And then the recently highlighted case of doping, and a really bizarre explanation from a trainer-owner of how cocaine could be found in one of the dogs. I could give you a list of the prohibited substances that have been found in random sampling of greyhounds in the past 2 years, and a list of those trainers of those dogs who continue training. So what's needed is more out-of-competition testing, full publication of the tests, and if a Class A positive is found, the Irish Greyhound Board should inform the Gardaí and the Department of Agriculture. It is a state-funded industry. And then the other greyhounds. Over the last year, campaign groups, individuals and the media have been highlighting the fate of Irish greyhounds being exported to countries with poor or no animal welfare standards. Our greyhounds, they adapt well as family pets, but when they're of no use here, they are exported to horrific circumstances and cruel deaths, to be used in the dog meat trade, as live bait in fights between wild animals in so-called zoos in countries like China and Pakistan, India and South America. And they're also being exported through European countries and the US. So if we're serious about animal welfare, we have to ban exporting all greyhounds to any country other than the UK, with the exception of rescued greyhounds from established reputable centres in Ireland going to reputable adoption groups abroad. We need more accurate and up-to-date traceability of all Irish-born greyhounds from birth to death. And then the general live exports of our farm animals, which does involve long journeys, overcrowded conditions, deprivation of food and water, inadequate ventilation, rough handling, and they're going to countries with slaughter practices that are immensely cruel. And there is evidence for all of this available. We have other issues. We know that fox hunting continues. I accepted a petition this morning from a gentleman who had collected over 10,000 signatures against fox hunting. And whatever chance the fox might have in a hunt, he has absolutely no chance whatever in the cruel, barbaric practice of the digging out of foxes. Fur farming continues, albeit on a much smaller scale now in Ireland. But it's estimated that over 200,000 mink are killed for the remaining 3 fur farms in Ireland. I'm glad we have an amendment here on animals in circuses, which I will also support, because we know that there are animals in circuses and the circus is completely unsuitable for that animal. Badgers, we're still waiting on the rollout of the vaccine, which would eliminate the very cruel way they're treated. And then the recent Ballinasloe horse fair. Despite reduced numbers of people and animals there, the ISPCA were as busy as ever. 3 ponies, 3 donkeys and 10 dogs were removed, and it goes on and on. The legislation is worthless unless it's implemented, and the legislation that we have is not being implemented. And I don't know whether that's through indifference, whether it's through ignorance, whether it's through disinterest, allied with a lack of the adequate resources and personnel to ensure implementation.
Thanks, Corla. I'm delighted to have a brief opportunity to speak on this important motion brought forward by my colleagues, Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, Deputy Clare, Daly and the other members of the Independence for Change Technical Group, and I want to commend my colleagues on this. And while there has been some tiny progress in animal welfare since the 2013 Act, there are still increasing reports of animal cruelty, loopholes in regulation and insufficient monitoring and enforcement across the spectrum of animal care. And as Deputy O'Sullivan said, Minister, I think you told the House this time last year that there had only been 13 successful prosecutions under the 2013 Animal Health and Welfare Act in 1 year, and that there were 38 prosecution files being processed at that time. These numbers seem incredibly low, given the many millions of animals reared each year. I think right now we've something about 11.5, 12 million basic domestic farm animals in the Republic alone. As you know, on the 21st of March this year, I introduced the Welfare of Greyhounds Amendment Bill 2017. I asked you about it earlier on, Minister, whether or not you could incorporate this bill into the bill on the greyhound industry, and I found your reply a few hours ago a bit disappointing, because, as you know, all we were seeking to try and do in the bill was to control the export of greyhounds and to provide for publication of the white list to which the export of greyhounds under licences would be permissible, and to make it an offence to export a greyhound to a country that's not included in the white list. Over recent years, of course, the welfare of our dogs being exported and racing and retired greyhounds, it's obviously become a major campaign issue. We know that Irish greyhounds were exported to Macau, China, to race in the famous Yat-Yuen Cannondrome, and obviously the public is very upset about reports of this, and that at the end of the day dogs are raced to death and then ended up somewhere in the food chain. The response, I think, from our government and the Greyhound Board regarding the export of our Irish dogs to countries with appalling or no animal welfare standards whatsoever, it has so far been totally useless, Minister. So while the white list that we proposed in the Welfare of Greyhounds Amendment Bill 2017, it can't provide at the moment for the selling on other jurisdictions, it does give Ireland the opportunity to be a leader in this area. I did listen very carefully, of course, Minister, to campaigners who basically want the export of greyhounds beyond these islands stopped completely. I also welcome contacts with MEP Nessa Childers to discuss the work of the European Parliament Animal Welfare Intergroup this autumn, and the possibility that the European Parliament obviously can establish centres across the current 28 European countries. The Greyhound Rescue Association, of course, claims that there are around 38 greyhounds being put down monthly, and traceability issues remain also because greyhounds are not microchipped from birth. And the GRA, of course, claimed that up to 10,000 of our wonderful Irish greyhounds could be unaccounted for each year. And, of course, earlier in the year, as I mentioned this afternoon, Minister, broadcaster Sharon Viola on prime time, they aired the famous programme Gone to the Dogs, which put the spotlight on doping and the poor regulation generally in the greyhound industry in Ireland. Obviously, this is an area you said earlier on that you had concerns about, and perhaps in your response you might come back in a fuller way and to talk about that. And of course, animal welfare extends not only to our greyhounds but to all our animals. And in keeping with the theme of racing animals for profit, I also want to echo the comments of Deputy O'Sullivan in regard of coursing hares. Just last week I asked the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gael, Ms Heather Humphreys, Deputy Heather Humphreys, to report on the monitoring of coursing trials around the country, whether breaches of trial rules have taken place in the last number of years, and what the repercussions for the breach of the coursing club's trials rules, what are those repercussions? And she said that hare coursing meetings are monitored as resources allow by conservation rangers of the National Parks and Wildlife Service of my department. However, she goes on to say that due to a lack of resources, no monitoring whatsoever took place in 2015-2016. My colleague has mentioned the abuse of other beautiful animals, such as the minks and indeed the range of other animals. And of course, it has to be said that perhaps we do need to change and to look into the future and change the structure, indeed, of our whole agriculture, which did develop into a very industrial system when I was a child and we were rearing pigs and cattle and sheep and on a different system, on a much more sustainable system. But this incredible industrialised process, which currently produces 33% of our carbon emissions and does involve, we've just mentioned the transporting of live animals, does involve considerable cruelty to our animals, is something that we have to start moving away from. We have a wonderful land minister. We have the resources to have a much more sustainable type of agriculture as well, and I think we should move towards that. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. Deputy Wallace.
Thank you, Concordia. I too welcome Maureen O'Sullivan's bill, and I don't think she's asking too much. Really, what it amounts to is that she thinks that it's wrong that we tolerate cruelty towards animals. And the truth of the matter is that the vast majority of Irish people don't agree with any kind of cruelty to animals, but the truth also is that we're probably not really doing enough to address it where it does happen. The Animal Health and Welfare Act, which did come into force in 2014, it did mark a significant step forward in animal welfare in Ireland, and Minister Coveney at the time was certainly praised for his efforts and his openness to amendments and general patience, and there was a lot of work went into it. But at the time, I remember the Minister was also criticised for the failure to deal with animal cruelty around hare coursing, digging out foxes, the use of traps in badger culling and fur farms, which Maureen has already highlighted tonight. The legislation empowered authorised officers to enter property, examine animals and even to seize animals or other evidence when appropriate. It enabled authorised officers to deal with issues far more effectively than before. However, huge problems still exist with the enforcement of the legislation, and as Maureen said back then, that the proof of the pudding will be the implementation of codes of practice and the resources provided. We need to see enforcement of our animal welfare laws, and if necessary, if this is what it takes, there will have to be more severe punishment from the courts for those convicted of cruelty to animals. Lack of enforcement is a problem, and the ISPCA argue that penalties imposed have not been particularly high and do not serve as a deterrence, and that, generally speaking, penalties imposed have been at the lower end of the scale. Enforcement of many aspects of the legislation is dependent on ISPCA inspectors. They have a team of 8 uniformed inspectors who currently cover 17 counties, so half the country is not covered. In 2016, following a submission to the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Agriculture, the committee recommended that, given the ISPCA's service agreement with the Minister, they should be given more funding to allow recruitment of enough inspectors to cover the whole of the country. This is yet to happen. Similarly, National Parks and Wildlife Service rangers go to hare coursing events and report on them. But as Maureen pointed out, there is no monitoring of coursing trials, which are organised prior to official hare coursing fixtures to test the performance of the greyhounds, and there is live hares used at these events. Animal welfare sanctuary volunteers and managers repeatedly say the legislation has simply not been acted upon. In relation to Dog Breeding Establishment Act 2010, the ISPCA have said that there is a lack of enforcement, guidelines not being met, and there is widespread non-compliance. Animal shelters across the country are overworked, underfunded, and are hugely exasperated with the government's failure to deal with mandatory microchipping. Maureen also touched on greyhounds, an issue we've raised here over the last few years, especially around the abuses around drugs, and sadly it is the bigger players that are involved in it. Now, there has been some improvements made, but I think a lot more work still has to be done for us to clean up the industry. I don't have an awful lot of time. I just want to touch on There was a protest last week against the export of live cattle, and I managed to get a bit of notoriety from the farming sector for actually even attending it. But I think most people actually acknowledge that travel time on the ships is too long. It's not natural. We're sending cattle outside of the EU, where EU rules in terms of how the cattle are being dealt with or how they're killed no longer apply. And I'm wondering, is the government doing anything about it? Surely, even from an economic point of view, we should be processing more at home, and we should stop the export of live cattle. Now, I do understand part of the problem. I know that a lot of the cattle that go come from the dairy herd. Dairy farmers, they're using Holstein bulls to try and produce heifers for dairy. They end up with a product with a whole lot of bulls that are not attractive to the meat industry. I'm just wondering, for example, as an alternative, would they consider targeting the cows that would produce the Holstein heifer for milk through the AI, the artificial insemination, and use the likes of Aberdeen Angus bulls, redheads, and with the rest of the herd, so that we will actually have a good beef product coming in the other area. Obviously, a little bit of work in it, but I think it's something the government should consider.
Thank you very much. Now, Minister Andrew Doyle, please.
Thank you, Count Corla. I'd like to welcome the opportunity to discuss the matter of animal welfare in the House, and I'd like first of all to emphasise the Government's commitment to animal welfare and to reiterate that this Government does not tolerate any instance of animal cruelty. There is no doubt that there is greater engagement than ever by the public at large with issues relating to animal welfare. The public interest has been given concrete expression in the Animal Health and Welfare Act, which was adopted by the Oireachtas following extensive and positive debate. The Act provides a modern and robust framework for dealing with animal welfare-related issues. I wanted to focus tonight on the significant progress that has been made in recent years in the area of the welfare of animals. In particular, I am glad that the Deputy's motion acknowledges the progress that the Animal Health and Welfare Act has brought about. The Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013 was a major piece of legislation that updated and replaced around 40 pieces of primary legislation in the animal welfare and health going back to over 100 years. The Act changed the basis upon which animal owners must treat their animals. The Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013 enshrined the principles of the 5 freedoms for animals. They are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury and disease, freedom to exhibit natural behaviour, and freedom from fear and distress. These requirements are a fundamental shift in the way that this issue is dealt with under the Irish legal system. The Animal Health and Welfare Act is designed to allow intervention in a much wider range of cases than previously. As a result, minor cases can be tackled before they escalate, and the Act is a vehicle to encourage and educate animal keepers. In the past, where the 1911 Protection of Animals Act was the only recourse available, it could only be used where significant suffering had, in fact, occurred. This new approach means that we will be able to tackle problems when they are relatively minor, which makes the risk of escalation much lower. Enforcement is a complex issue and one which needs to be examined in detail. This is another progressive aspect of the Act in that it does not just focus on prosecution, which is only appropriate in cases where there have been serious welfare issues that can be clearly demonstrated to the courts. The new enforcement approach reflects the need to intervene as early as possible in animal welfare situations. The Act provides for animal health and welfare notices to be issued by authorised officers. This means that minor situations can be addressed at an early stage and that encouragement, guidance and best practice are introduced rather than just punishment. In terms of actual prosecutions, 35 cases have been successfully prosecuted in recent years, with a further 26 in various stages of preparation with a view to prosecuting. Furthermore, the Act contains provisions that where an individual is convicted of a serious animal welfare offences, the courts may ban them from keeping animals, or indeed restrict the numbers of animals they may keep. In some cases, welfare issues are due less to innate cruelty than to the animal owner's capacity to care for his or her animals being overwhelmed. Therefore, this provision allows for cases where an individual's mental well-being is best protected by allowing them to keep a fewer amount of animals. The provisions of the Act are enforced by authorised officers, and my department, on Garda Síochána, officers of Customs and Excise, authorised officers of both the ISP SPCA and Dublin SPCA are included. This cooperation with other organisations has been a major departure under the Act, and the arrangement has been working well. Individual officers of the Turf Club and Bord na Gan have also been authorised by the Act, and I would like to express my thanks to these bodies for their valuable contribution to animal welfare. The Animal Health and Welfare Act has been well received by both upon enactment and as it has been rolled out and implemented. All of our major animal welfare NGOs and stakeholders have seen it as a major progressive improvement in the area. In addition, the Act sets out clearly legal enforceable parameters relating to the activities such as hunting and coursing, which must occur in a lawful fashion that avoids wilful or unnecessary cruelty. And as regards non-legislative solutions, the actions taken by my department to protect animal welfare go beyond mere legislation, notwithstanding how progressive and flexible that may be. For example, the Farm Animal Welfare Advisory Council, a multi-stakeholder group that meets on a national and regional basis and includes representatives from farmers, the Department of Agriculture and the animal welfare organisations. This advisory council has been very successful in its regional forum in acting as an early warning system. Similarly, where natural and weather events have led to problems in certain locations, my department has acted quickly and effectively to bring about emergency supplies of feed to particular premises where feed has been an issue. Since 2011, over €11 million in total has been provided in ex gratia payments, reaching approximately 140 animal welfare organisations throughout the country annually. Monitoring of animal welfare is something that has been raised, and this is something that occurs on a number of levels and forums. On the farm side, cross-compliance inspections by the department flags up welfare issues, and departmental veterinary staff carry out regular inspections. In the context of monitoring, I think the increased awareness of animal welfare means that the issue is something that can be raised whenever it occurs, and that has been facilitated in particular by the animal welfare helpline that my department has had in place for some years now. This helpline, low call 0761 064 408, along with a dedicated email address, animalwelfare@agriculture.gov.ie, facilitates the reporting by members of the public of any suspicion of poor animal welfare or animal cruelty taking place, whether within the realm of a farming situation or a sporting or recreational activity, or indeed in a public place or an urban setting. All calls received are treated in confidence and are followed up by the authorised officers. Similarly, there are a variety of people involved with animals, all of whom are aware of welfare issues and who can flag them as and when they arise. Officers of my department, the ISPCA, the Dublin SPCA officers, local vets and dog wardens in dog pounds, and of course members of the public and animal welfare NGOs all play a role. I am also bringing forward a new greyhound industry bill in the autumn, which addresses the governance of Bord na Gan, strengthens regulatory controls in the industry, modernises sanctions and improves integrity with a view to building a reputation for exceptional regulation in the sector. The draft general scheme of the bill has already progressed through the pre-legislative scrutiny phase, and a memorandum will go to the government in the coming weeks requesting approval to publish the updated general scheme and to submit it to the Office of Parliamentary Counsel for drafting. In conclusion, there is a lot of agreement on the issue, this issue. Animal welfare is an important issue. There have been huge improvements in legislative and non-legislative regime that have brought about a change in attitudes in this country. The few individuals who do neglect and abuse animals find themselves more likely to be punished than ever before, which is as it should be. Early education, understanding and awareness continue to improve and raise standards of animal welfare in this country. So, Count Corley, in view of the many positive developments that are taking place in the area of animal welfare, I'd like to commend this counter-motion to the House. Thank you.
We move now to Deputy Charlie McConalogue. Thank you, Minister. Deputy McConalogue.
Concorda, and I would like to very much welcome the motion being put forward tonight by the Independence for Change group and proposed by Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan. And certainly I would support a lot of what she outlines in her motion. However, we are also putting forward an amendment to the motion which we feel represents her own party's position in relation to it well, and deals with what we believe needs to be the most important thing which needs to happen, and we need to keep the pressure on in relation to, and that's enforcement and ensuring that the standards that are in place and that the welfare of animal is prioritised at government level, and that the resources are in place to ensure that the regulatory system there works to do what it was set out to do, and indeed that we ensure that there is no instances of animal cruelty and that welfare is paramount. Deputy O'Sullivan's motion outlines the progress that has been made since the introduction of the Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013, and also outlines the fact that our public policy needs to be directed towards ensuring that all possible measures are taken to protect the welfare of animals. The motion also calls for the introduction of a comprehensive system of monitoring conditions in which animals are kept and robust regulations to protect animals from abuse, cruel treatment, neglect and poor living conditions. I think our key point would be that we feel that there is a very strong and robust regulatory framework in place at the moment as a result of the Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013, and that ensures that high standards in animal welfare can be maintained and the strict sanctioning is in place for offenders. We also believe that Animal Health and Welfare Act in 2013, the importance of it giving authorised officers the authorised officer status to employees of the Irish Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals, the Dublin Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals and the Turf Club to carry out welfare-related duties. We now believe it is absolutely crucial, and our motion also calls, Minister, to ensure that the funding is in place to actually back that up, and that we see real progress in relation to the monitoring of animal welfare and ensuring that there is no place for cruelty, and indeed where there are instances of it, that as a state we are equipped to properly respond to it, to root it out, and indeed to ensure that the power of the law is brought to bear on those who abuse it. Since the introduction of the Animal Welfare Act, which my own party would have been involved in the initial stages of, and in terms of the first draft, and indeed in government previously as well, Fianna would have introduced the Wildlife Amendment Bill of 2010, and indeed the Dog Breeding Establishment Act of 2010 as well. But since that Animal Welfare, Health and Welfare Bill was introduced in 2013, and I think the Minister you referred to it, Minister, in your own contribution as well, there has been 34 prosecutions, successful prosecutions, taken by the Department of Agriculture, and I understand that there is an additional 26 currently ongoing, and that additional prosecutions also are being taken at regional level by the Garda Síochána. So I think, Minister, and I do believe there is inadequacies currently in relation to the backup and the support that is available to ensure those are implemented fully. And I think we all would agree, people in this House and across the board, the vast majority of people have a great care and respect for animals, and they play a very significant part in their lives. In the case of those who keep animals as pets, and indeed I also, as the party's agricultural spokesperson, engaging with the farming community, see first-hand as well the care and respect that the farming community also take in their husbandry of animals on a daily basis. But it is crucial that we have robust structures in place to ensure those that don't respect animals, or those that would that oversee and carry out cruelty to them. That there is means and ways of ensuring that where there's reports of that it's acted on immediately, and also that there is the proper resources in place so that there is an ability among those staff and those officers who oversee the legislation to actually have a strong awareness to to instances of abuse, so that they can actually act on it immediately. And to that end, I do think we need to see an increase in relation to the spending that comes from the Department of Agriculture to resource the agencies that enforce this legislation. Because, as has been pointed out by previous speakers, a dozen officers covering most of the country is simply not enough. And we need to see that the agencies properly equipped to deal with that. Also, in relation to the work carried out by our local authorities and the veterinary sections within the Minister, they are also under significant pressure, and they administer a very important role in relation to this. That is also something I believe that the Department needs to address and that needs to be ramped up. Obviously, before the Animal Health and Welfare Act of 2013, there was very disparate regulations and laws around this, and it was very important that that was brought together into one piece of legislation which was clear and indeed which could be administered and properly enforced. I think the introduction of fines was welcome and is proving to help streamline the system. The Animal Health and Welfare Act introduced a standard fine of maximum of €5,000, but also in major indictment fines which could range from €100,000 to €250,000, and those were welcome and heavy penalties to be introduced into the oversight system. The other key thing that the bill did as well, Minister, was it ensured that in terms of an animal's health, and its cruelty issues were also brought together and dealt with in the one light, and that they weren't separated. And before, the regulation really looked at those two in a separate manner. So overall, I wish to thank Deputy O'Sullivan and Independence for Change for bringing this forward and move the Fianna Fáil amendment to the motion.
McConalogue and Chancellor Jackie.
Thank you. As Concordia, my colleague has gone through the bill and the need for greater resources put in place to enforce legislation that is there at the moment. And the welfare of animals is paramount to all of us who are involved in the agricultural sector. And as a farmer myself, we pride ourselves on the way that our animals are cared for. I think a number of points need to be made. The standards that animals are kept in this country are extremely high, and obviously there is, you always have a few exceptions. Our dairy and beef farmers, the majority of them, are in quality assurance schemes at the moment, which have strict welfare regulations embroidered into them, and those welfare regulations have to be adhered to if farmers are to have access to the market. On the dairy sector, 100% of dairy farmers now are in the quality assurance, and the percentage in the beef sector is extremely high as well. And in some cases, on the bovine sector, at times farmers, there is cruelty to animals. And I suppose I was on the Animal Welfare Council at its inception, and we set up a liaison group at the time with the ISPCA, which with the farming organisations try to monitor these cases. And invariably those cases are caused by psychiatric or mental issues with the herd owner. And whether it's through a combination of bad weather, financial circumstances, or whatever, mental stress, whatever caused the mental stress to the herd owner, things got on top of them, and they weren't able to cater properly for their animals. But thankfully now there's a structure in place that's able to deal with that. And those animals, the number of stock on those farms can be greatly reduced, or in cases a herd owner can be prohibited from keeping animals on his holding, where he consistently doesn't adhere to proper welfare standards. So that's all very welcome, and that is enforced, and it ensures that in the very minority of cases where animals are being held in poor conditions, that situation is rectified. I suppose, there's been a lot of focus on live exports and, our shipping regulations. And, the strange bedfellows come together at times. And it's hard to see. We have commercial interests in this country who have tried to put barriers in the way of live exports for a number of years. And I have to compliment the Minister since, he's taken up office. He has opened up extra markets for our live exports, which is absolutely essential for the economic viability of our beef sector. And the regulations that our animals are exported on, the standard is at the highest possible level. Our standards are even above what the EU require from us. And the welfare of animals on those ships is second to none. And I just saw today where there was a PQ down which questioned the morality, which questioned the level of mortality on those shipments. I can assure that deputy that that the economic margin for those exporters is tight, and even for no other reason known on economics, they would ensure that the animals arrive in very good condition at their destination. And to have people questioning the way our live exports operate is just not on. And, we find it frustrating at times to get ships registered for exporting our animals, and it is a very slow process. But probably rightly so. And when those ships are passed for moving cattle for export, the standards at which they operate on are second to none. The Greyhound Bill has been mentioned here tonight frequently as well. And again, that has gone through the Joint Oireachtas Committee already and has gone to committee stage. And that will tighten up the regulations in the greyhound industry and restore confidence that the regulations that are there in place will be properly adhered to. And the stricter guidelines that will be put in place will ensure that there will be public confidence in the greyhound industry. The export of greyhounds out of this country has been mentioned as well, and that it should be banned, to certain countries around the world. And, our greyhounds, if they're exported, yes, they should be exported to a country where welfare standards are correct. And, that should be taken as a given. But I don't think people should make statements about that UK is the only destination that is fit for the export of our greyhounds. That's not correct. And other countries have very stringent welfare regulations as regards greyhounds as well. And that can be monitored and regulated going forward. But the export of greyhounds, again, is commercially essential to the existence of our greyhound industry. Hare coursing and the constant attack that there is on hare coursing. And again, I think people should recognise that only for the habitats that are regulated by the coursing clubs, our hare population will be under serious threat in rural Ireland. Coursing clubs put in a lot of effort into ensuring that a habitat exists for hares. And there is monitoring there for all hare coursing, and it's strictly monitored. And people should recognise the role that the custodians of the rural countryside play in protecting the hare. So, while we welcome the thrust of the bill, as Deputy McConalogue has said, we have put down amendments, and we would hope that the Government will put more resources in place, because the welfare of animals is in all our interests.
Rabbitte, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Deputy O'Sullivan and her colleagues for bringing forward this bill here this evening. And I want to thank Deputy McConalogue and Deputy Cahill for sharing their time with me to speak on it this evening. I'm not as well briefed as my two spokespeople in agriculture, and I'm coming from a completely different guise here tonight. I'm coming here as a person who loves animals. Myself and my family love animals. But I'm also coming from the whole guise that I see the wonderful work that the ISPCA do in supporting the various departments and in working with the Department of Agriculture. Just this week we've had, and I think Deputy O'Sullivan alluded to it, we had the Ballinasloe Horse Fair, and it's a fantastic economic boost to the town and to the surrounding areas, and it is very welcome, that has to be said. But what is very disturbing sometimes is when you turn onto Facebook or you go on Twitter or you see what's going on, and you see disturbed puppies or young dogs, and they're caged in and they're overcrowded. I can totally understand why, when you, Minister, in your opening thing, you say the freedom for hunger and thirst, the freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain and injury, the freedom to exhibit natural behaviours and the freedom from fear and distress. I can tell you this weekend, and it possibly happens in an awful lot of places up and down the country, that that wasn't the case or the experience for some animals. And that's why we do have a large gathering here in the gallery tonight, because there's a large population of people who live by and believe in those principles, the same as I do and the same as you do. And it's quite disturbing to see that when you go to fairs or you go to various events where you're bringing your family, because that is not what we believe in. That's not what we've amended the legislation for. That's not what it's about. Deputy Wallace talked about we don't have enough inspectors. We don't have enough enforcement. We need to see more of that. The ISPCA are looking for that. They want to help more. They want to be more involved. They are the eyes and ears out there for the small animals, for the wee puppies that are being presented, for the greyhounds, the old greyhounds, the lurchers that you talk about. The farmers, and Deputy Cahill has hit the nail on the head. He speaks very eloquently there. Like, the farmers in this country work very, very hard to protect and mind their animals and look after them. But we have a segment of society there that want to make money out of breeding dogs and portraying them then in cages. That's not the way people want to see it. I'm really asking you tonight that you would free up resources to support the ISPCA, to give them more money, that the people that have the powers to ensure that they adhere to the powers. And when we talk about 35 convictions, we're talking in very large-scale reasons. But a lot of the trust of what Deputy O'Sullivan has talked about here this evening, we're talking about the puppy farms, we're talking about the cruelty that takes place in relation to the likes of the fairs or the likes of the trades, where you see animals caged in the backs of jeeps or in the trailers. People don't like that. People don't want that. That day has to go. And we're calling on you. And that's why I am standing here with Deputy McConalogue in what he has put in as amendments. Because the trust of it, what we're looking for in our amendments, to call on the government and the relevant authorities to ensure that the current animal welfare protection regulation and robustly enforced, and that any offences which occur are promptly investigated, and that the full sanctioning powers are applied. We're also calling for adequate animal welfare funding by the Department of Agriculture to organisations who directly deliver animal care and welfare services. And I talk about my own area, the Heathland Sanctuary. And we're also calling on the government to ensure that an all-Ireland animal health and welfare strategy is protected in the upcoming Brexit negotiations, to ensure that the continued operation of unified animal health and welfare approach on this island. I don't wish to repeat myself again. I'm supporting our amendment to our motions this evening, because it's all about, we have the legislation, it's about the enforcement at this stage, Minister. Thank you.
Before we move to the next speaker, could I just ask the Minister, was it intended to move amendment number 2? And you
I'm moving the amendment.
Thank you very much, Minister. We now move to the Sinn Fein slot, Deputy Martin Kenny.
I want to welcome the motion from Deputy O'Sullivan. The motion this evening, as has been outlined by many here, is really about looking after the animals that we have, both as pets and as domestic animals across the country, and also in the farmyards. Now, by and large, much of what's in this motion is really acknowledging that there is legislation there to deal with this, but that it isn't getting enough emphasis and that there isn't enough resources being put to it. And I think nobody would argue with that, and certainly the fact that there's so few ISPC inspectors going around doing this kind of work around the country is evidence that there needs to be more resources put into it. Of course, in many of our local authorities around the country, we also have vets, etc., that do some of this work, and it varies. You know, that's one of the experiences that most of us would have. In different counties, it varies as the level of interest that's taken in it and the level of emphasis that goes into it. And I think that's something that certainly could be looked at to see how much more that can be strengthened as well. The Fianna Fáil amendment to the motion says an awful lot of the same stuff that's in the motion, with maybe a little bit of softer language, really. And from that point of view, I don't understand exactly where it's going to, but I accept that's fine. The Fine Gael amendment to the motion is really just a sort of saying that we have everything very good, thank you very much. And I think, in fairness to Deputy O'Sullivan and the people who put forward this motion, their view, and I think the view of the vast majority of people in the country, is that things aren't perfect, that there is issues here and that they do need to be dealt with. And I think the final the final amendment, the third amendment from Solidarity PPP around the circuses and the travelling animals in circuses, I think, is something that we would also support as an amendment to this motion, because it's clearly the situation. Whatever argument there was maybe 100 years ago for bringing exotic animals around and people had an interest in seeing them, that argument is long gone, and it probably never existed. But there certainly is every opportunity for people to go and see these animals in a more natural habitat, whether it's in a zoo or on their television screen nowadays, rather than having to see them in cages and circuses. And I think that's very valid, and we'd certainly be supporting that amendment as well. The issue in regard to, particularly to cattle and to the whole issue of farm cruelty and what happens on a lot of the farms around the country, it's my experience living in County Leitrim, where it's predominantly an agricultural area, and for many, many years we had instances of cruelty on the farmyard, where you had person who had too much stock on the land, they weren't able to keep them, there was issues of neglect and stuff like that happening. Generally, in fairness, it was sometimes very elderly farmers who just kept on the stock, didn't sell their cattle, and you know, as has been said by others, there could have been issues around mental health in some cases. But in many cases, it really was down to not having the correct setup. Now, in recent years, there has been much improvements in particularly the housing of cattle and all that sort of thing. That has improved things greatly in respect to that, and I don't think it is as big an issue as it would have been in the past. That said, it's still an issue that needs to be dealt with, and there still needs to be appropriate measures in place to ensure that that happens. I'm just thinking of dogs, and you know, when I was growing up at home, we always had a dog, and he was the first person that welcomed you home, and it didn't matter what state you come home in, or whether you were in good humour or bad humour, the dog was always in great humour. The tail was wagging and they were happy to see you. I think that's one of the connections that humans have with the canine, that you know, we have that little connection. I think everyone recognises that and understands that. And certainly, if that is abused by anyone under any circumstances, you know, all of us are affected by it and are worried about it. The horses and the issue about horses was also brought up. And in many, many places around the country, we had, and I know it was one of the symptoms of the Celtic tiger was that anyone who was doing very well either got a donkey or a pony or a horse for their children, even if they didn't have, you know, 10 square yards to put it on. And they ended up, when the burst came, that the country was full of them. And many of them were just dumped along the roadside and neglected. And I think that's a lesson to be learnt there in respect of that if people are going to have animals, that they need to have the appropriate means of taking care of them and looking after them. The neglect that we see in many cases around horses, and you know, we often see stuff on Facebook and on social media, and the way that animals are treated and their hooves not pared and all that sort of thing happen, is really down to the individuals who allow that to happen, who carry on in that way, really need to be dealt with the full force of the law. I think that's one of the problems, and one of the issues that I think is being highlighted in this motion, is that the full force, in many cases, people experience is that it doesn't happen. And I think we need to ensure that there's additional resources put there in respect of that. The big issue in respect of all of this is around humans being responsible for what they have control over. And very, very many people take control over animals, and whether it's in a farm setting and it's their livelihood, and if it's their livelihood, naturally enough, it's in their best interest to make sure that the animal progresses and thrives and does the best they possibly can. And in those circumstances, the vast, vast majority of farmers and those that are engaged in agriculture do so. Now, the issue has also been raised about exporting cattle, live animals, to various countries around the world, and we see that going on. And I do accept, and I do think that there is a point to be made that putting an animal on a boat and sending them out to Egypt or somewhere into a very hot climate, you know, there just need to be very strict regulations in regard to all of that, when you consider the kind of climate that they've grown up in and flourished in here and where they're going to. Now, having said that, one of the reasons why most people in the agricultural sector would be wanting to see a prosperous and a good live export trade is because of the monopoly that the factories have on the prices that farmers get for their beef and for their cattle. and that farmers see this as a means of being able to export the animals abroad, and therefore there's a little bit of scarcity and the price might go up. And it's down to the economics of that, which I think is a problem, and it's something that I think we need to be able to deal with. And it's a problem that's a little bit bigger than just the animal cruelty issue. It's around other stuff as well. But really and truly, the possibility of processing and developing more markets for our beef and for our lamb and for our other meat products in this country to other countries and being able to process them and create the jobs here is a much more appropriate way to deal with this than live export. And I think everyone would agree with that. But the problem we've got is that the factories and the big processors have such a monopoly and such a stranglehold on that whole industry, and that needs to be dealt with. And if that is dealt with properly, it would certainly assist greatly with dealing with the whole issue of live exports. And that's not to say, and I do concur, that there are strict regulations in regard to that, and there are inspections carried out in respect of it. We've heard reports of some abuses taking place, and if there are, they need to be dealt with. Finally, and I just want to commend the motion. I certainly feel the Sinn Féin will be supporting the motion as it stands, and will also be supporting the amendment number 3. The amendment from both the Government and Fianna Fáil we won't be supporting on this occasion, but we do accept that the Fianna Fáil motion is very similar, as we say. But if we support the Fianna Fáil motion in respect of this, Fianna Fáil amendment in respect of this, then the third motion, which is about the circus animals, would also fall. So that wouldn't be appropriate. So in that context, we're certainly going to support the motion and the third amendment to it. And I feel that there is great credit to be given to Maureen O'Sullivan and to those who put forward this. And in fairness, it's not something that's trying to rub anyone's nose in it. It's trying to say, look, there's an issue here and we need to deal with it, and the way to deal with it is to put more resources in place to ensure that animal health and welfare is looked after efficiently and effectively.
Next speaker is in Chapter Michael Fitzmaurice.
And I welcome the opportunity on speaking on this motion and commend Deputy O'Sullivan. Firstly, in relation to the greyhound industry has had a lot of problems over the last few years and a lot of controversy, and I know that there's regulation coming, and I think that that's welcome, because the industry itself, for its own benefit, has to make sure that it does things right. There has been too much found out in the last while. That's not good for any industry, no matter what you're at. And I think that needs sorting out, and especially, in the in-life of the dogs, whether it's England or wherever, people bring their pets to different countries, even on holiday. It's about how you look after them, and they do deserve dignity. I have heard people talking about, and people need to understand this, about the likes of foxes and deers in different areas. And the reality of it is, in rural Ireland, we come from a managed landscape, and in the line of foxes, if foxes go out of control, and this is reality, you will end up that the old fox will be waggling along a road with the hair nearly gone of him if you don't have a controlled landscape. And that's the reality. People mightn't like to hear that, but that's what happens. And do we want to see him killed with a care or dying a slow death? Because if they get too old, that's what ends up happening. Unfortunately, we have seen the same problems in the line of the deer sector. And we come from a controlled landscape or a managed landscape that way. In the line of throughout Ireland, and as Deputy Kinney rightly pointed out, the dog nearly every night in rural parts of Ireland sleeps under the blankets in the bed. There's more thought to him than nearly anyone else in the house. And that's a true reflection. The dog, the minute you come, he welcomes you. It's your one friend. If everyone's in bed, the dog will come out to see you. And that's the way rural Ireland lives. They treat things with respect. They love their animals. And, we are brought up in rural parts of Ireland to make sure that we respect, especially our animals. And, there seems to be this concept, and maybe there isn't enough of people in the ISPCA or whatever, and resources need to be put in. And regulation is there already, in my view, to make sure that this is working. And the other thing that people need to understand, and it was referred to early on, maybe someone gets sick in the line of being a farmer, that they could get sick, or they may have health issues. But what happens? Well, I'll tell you what happens. For those that don't understand it, the neighbours come round, and be it day or night, they go and they help the people, and they look after their animals as well as their own. And that happens in every village round this country, and it's great that it does every day of the week. In the line of live exports, we want to watch where we're going in all of this, for the simple reason there is a commercial interest in this country that and in other countries, and it's well known that in some countries in Europe there was other interests paying people to make sure they protested against live exports. I can tell you tonight that if there's a ship going from Ireland with the regulation, and sometimes we give out about, you know, a ship being held up because of licensing and all that, but in fairness, I'll say one thing about the department: they're doing it well. And there is an animal on a boat tonight is treated better than a person maybe within a hospital A&E tonight, and that is factual. This minute, in any part of rural Ireland, if you want a doctor, it takes an hour. If there's anything wrong with your animal, you have a vet within 10 to 15 minutes to make sure that that animal is looked after. Cattle, you either slaughter them in Ireland or export them. But with the layerage facilities, and this is, some people don't understand this, I've seen videos coming in to me from people that sadly don't understand the situation. First of all, the video was of cattle in some other country that wasn't in the EU because they hadn't even tags on them. Second of all, they were within like a one-man show band thing, some part of the world we don't know. But they need to get factual in what Ireland does. We have strict regulation in this country, and I think, in fairness to the Department of Agriculture, they do it fairly well. In the line of, I saw it mentioned earlier on, the likes of Ballinasloe Horse Fair, there is people from the department going round there every day making sure that things are done right. And, like, are we going to go down a road to say that the fish in the bowl that the youngster got for Christmas, is that cruelty? Or is the bird in the cage that in most towns and cities around the country is within it? Is that animal cruelty? We want to just decide what we're talking about, because I believe if you treat something as we're brought up with, and that's what people need to understand. People in rural parts of Ireland don't just see a horse when they're 20. They might be brought up from a nipper with it, or they're brought up with cattle or sheep or whatever, and they're taught to respect them and be kind to them. Whereas in some parts of the country, I don't like to see that in small areas, horses are confined, and in my opinion, you don't have the fodder for them, you don't have the facilities for them, and you cannot give them the same respect as what they get in other parts of the country. I fully believe, and I think there's nobody doubts or nobody questions, that there needs to be good animal welfare in every country. Not alone Ireland, but in every country. But the one thing I would say to anybody, when we export an animal, if I have a car and I sell it to someone in Cork, how can I know what they'll do down the road in a year or 2 or 3? I'm not responsible for them. But my job and my way of life is to treat, be it an animal or a car or whatever I have, with respect while I have it. At the end of the day, we need to make sure that we do everything as good as possible. But in fairness to our Department of Agriculture, and I fight with them on a lot of things, but I will say one thing about them. In the line of animal welfare right around the country, be it in marts, in factories, and in exporting, they are pretty well on the ball, and they don't let much pass, I can tell you that. They will make sure that things are done right, and rightly so. And yes, when the cattle are going to a foreign land, it is a long trip, but many a person sail to America on a boat, and the same there's better facilities now in it, on that ship, than people travelled in years ago. And rightly so. I agree that there should be. But we need to get it into context of what we're doing. And also, whether we like it or whether we don't, farmers have to make a living. You won't be able to keep every animal you have looking at them for the rest of your life and petting them down by the garden, or you won't survive. So you have to make sure obviously cattle will go and be fattened and be killed. That's a reality no matter what walk of life, be it a chicken or be it an animal. And I think that by all means we need to make sure that we do have proper regulation, that we have enough of people on the ground. I agree with that 100%, but we need to put this into context.
I'd like to welcome this debate on animal welfare in Ireland. I think it's a very timely debate. It's one issue that I've been very involved in, same as I think some deputies here, Maureen and so forth. We now have a relatively progressive legislation on the statute books for the past 4 years. Despite this, we are seeing an increasing number of reports of mistreatment and abuse of animals. It's clear there's a massive gap in resources when it comes to enforcement. Organisations such as the Irish Society to Prevent Cruelty for Animals rely on public donations up to 90%. And I was reading the People for Profit manifesto on animal welfare, and I just want to it's a really good document on animal welfare, but I just want to point out 3 or 4 things that were in the document, which I won't have going time to. But 3 or 4 things is a full audit of animal welfare issues in Ireland to be carried out. Other ones is a stricter punishment and serious fines for those who abuse animals for commercial purposes. Promote responsible pet ownership through school curriculum. Introduce measures requiring all animals, especially pigs and poultry, to be provided with adequate space, natural light and opportunities to carry out their natural behaviours. So that's some of the P4Profit manifesto. Let's call it. There's one issue that I want to speak on tonight. It's an issue that's very close to my heart, is horses, particularly horse in an urban environment. And I think when I was a councillor in South Dublin County Council, I was shocked, and that's an understatement, by the amount of horses that were basically impounded, neglected and destroyed. And if you look over the last 10 years, literally tens of thousands of horses have been destroyed in this country. I know in South Dublin County Council, in a period of 4 years, I think probably up to 1,000 horses were destroyed at the cost of about €1 million to the taxpayer. And as a person that loves horses and all animals, I was just shocked by this wanton neglect and cruelty, particularly in a country where the horse is esteemed creature. And I was just taken aback by them figures. And it's depressing when you see them figures, and they can get you down and so forth. But I think, as a councillor, as a person, I wanted to try to do something about it. And then, obviously, over them years, the figures have fluctuated. They've gone down a little bit, but still, the figures are way too much. Too much. So I think the Minister was out in Clondalkin in February to the opening of the Clondalkin Equine Club, and that gives young horse owners a place to call their own. It's the first unique social horse project in Ireland, where horse owners from Clondalkin, young horse owners, can keep their horses in an urban environment. It's a really, really good project. Not perfect by any means, but we're trying to promote equine education, equine responsibility, and all that comes with it. And because, sometimes really, I've seen the worst, absolutely the worst equine neglect that you could imagine. But I've also seen the best equine good practice and so forth. And I think that should be promoted through other county councils around the country, and I think it's a good project. I think the enforcement of people that neglect horses. I mean, there's some people that shouldn't even own a goldfish, never mind a horse. The majority of people that own horses are responsible, and they take good care of their horses. There's a minority of people, a small minority of people, that are unscrupulous, and they're dealers of horses, and they don't care They don't care about their horses. They don't care about the community that keeps equines in a good way. They don't really care about anybody. And they're the people that, you know, the enforcement should go after, the police and so forth. I mean, there's already laws there, the Control of Horses Act in 1996. I mean, that is a good piece of legislation, but it's not enforced. It's not enforced. Ultimately, it's not enforced. I mean, when was the last person that was sent to jail because of abuse of a horse, or neglect of a horse, or an abandonment of a horse, or dealer of a horse? I mean, I can't think of any. So I think, I mean, just to get back on the Clondalkin Equine project, I think it's a really good project. You know, you see young people. There's something amazing about a young person and an animal. I mean, again, I'm not a horse owner as such, but it's a great thing to see when a young person, you know, is with the horse. They get a bond with the horse. They get an education from the horse, and that's a good thing. It's not perfect by any means in Clondalkin, but you know what? What was happening before wasn't acceptable, you know. But now at least we're trying to address the issue in Clondalkin, and hopefully, I mean, the Equine Club, the people that have run it, they've gone down to Limerick, they've gone around different parts of the country to promote this idea that a social horse project, not going to be, you know, it's not going to the whole panacea of urban horse ownership, but at least it's better than what is happening at the moment, where horses are basically it's conveyor belt, impounded by the council, destroyed, and people like horse owners themselves are kind of losing out, and the taxpayer losing out. Just the last thing, Ceann Comhairle, I think, you know, on the whole subject of animal cruelty, you know, I've been at protests last week about the live export of farm animals. I've been at protests about hair coursing. I mean, hair coursing, I mean, I think it's absolutely bizarre. You know, over 100 TDs in this chamber support hair coursing. I mean, I just find it bizarre. I just find it a bizarre sport that like somebody can get pleasure, you know, by chasing a hair around. I just, it's completely alien. You know, I don't understand. But I think, you know, as long as we live in a society that's profit-ridden, you'll always get cruelty and the abhorrence that comes with industrialised farming. As long as you have that profit-driven society and that system, you will have cruelty to animals. Because I think animals there has to be somebody to speak up for animals, like human beings, you know. And I think where we have a society where, you know, animals and human beings try to coexist and does not want them cruelty, because I don't think most people are cruel to their animals. Actually, we live in a very country that loves animals. But, you know, as long as that system is in place, where you see farming, particularly industrialised farming, where it kills animals particularly horribly, I think you'll have that. I think you will try to end this. Thank you.
Can we move on to the rural independence? We have a total of 7.5 minutes, and I call on Deputy Michael Healy-Rae, whom I understand is sharing with his colleagues. Agreed.
First of all, I don't mean to pick an argument with the previous speaker, but I have to say there is a group of people in Ireland who talk up for animals every day of the week, and they are called our farming community, because that's what they do. They do their best by their farms and by their animals. They're the custodians of the farms who inherit them themselves. They want to pass them on to the future generations, and they will never want to do anything that would be anyway negative or bad for their animals, because I want to compliment the farming community for changing and coming forward so much, be it with sheds, slurry storage, trying to improve their own little corner of the world, and they've done a great job. And there's a group of people that are in your department, Minister, and I want to use this opportunity here tonight. I've had the pleasure of being in Agricultural House for a good number of years now, and I want to thank every single solitary person that works below there. in all the different departments. And like previous speakers might have said, there's times we might be arguing about payments being a bit late or delayed, but overall I want to say that I thank every person that's working in the Department of Agriculture, whether it's down here or around the rest of the country, because they're doing a good job, and I compliment them. But I would ask you to always try and make sure that payments go out in time, because they're badly needed, and I'd ask you to always keep an eye on that. Coming back to live export, I want to say here very clearly tonight, I'm 100% committed to the future of live export in this country. The standards that are being applied are of the highest standard. And anybody that thinks that animals are mistreated just because they're being carried abroad live, they're wrong. They haven't been on board these boats. They haven't seen the conditions. The conditions, people try to say that it's something that it's not. These people are in the business of exporting animals for sale. They don't want to lose animals. They don't want animals to be mistreated. They're fed, they're watered, they're bedded, and they're minded. And I want to make that quite clear. And we must be fair to our farming community. And they're doing their level best to make a living. And the one thing that was said here, it was as if there was something wrong out of making a living. You have to rear meat to kill it, to eat it. It doesn't jump from a farm onto your plate. It's obvious what has to be done.
Thank you very much, Les Councillor. First of all, I want to remind everyone here inside that the farming community, and indeed myself being a farmer, we were always brought up to make sure that animals weren't mistreated and to make sure that they were fed, because if we did anything untoward to an animal, we were told to turn back on yourself and you would have bad luck. So 99% of the people care for animals, and especially the farmers, and we have to recognise the great efforts that farmers have made with building modern sheds, airy sheds, plenty of room for cattle. Indeed, I'll just give one example of a magnificent outfit in Kilgarvan. It's called the Cruelty Valley Co-op, where they're the most modern method and ways of feeding and treating and keeping the pigs. It has to be seen to really recognise and appreciate what's going on there. A wonderful operation run by a man by Christy Hosey for the last 40 years, and we're very proud of it. That's what I have to say. The greyhound industry, I'm getting a lot of calls in Kerry about doping and of greyhounds in events around the country, and it has affected our trade, and I'm asking that that be checked out and that it be stopped, because it's hurting a lot of people who have lived for greyhounds and see after them very well. The live cattle trade, I support that trade, because other than that, if we don't have that live cattle trade, the factories will have more of a monopoly, and indeed they have too much of a stranglehold on the price that farmers are allowed to get at the present time for their efforts. I have to say, in relation to other types of animals, there is not enough control of mink, foxes, badgers, grey crows, magpies, pine martens, sea deer and seagulls, who adversely affect our domestic animals and ground nesting birds. That has to be addressed, and it should be addressed in this bill as well.
Last Councillor, look, I also came from a farm, born and reared, with every kind of an animal that you ever had, from cows to pigs to sheep to dogs to hens to everything. And we had, and a reference we made tonight, at the animal husbandry in 99.9% of the farms. And someone referred to mental health issues, and possibly in our occasion there is cruelty because of different pressures and disturbing. And I have great respect for Deputy O'Sullivan and Dr. O'Sullivan, but I cannot agree with the thrust of this bill. As I said, I have the height of respect for the farmers and the way they try and do their business, and you, Minister, and your staff as well. But I raised this issue again here today about a cohort of people that, in a reply you gave back to me here about horses. And we come in Tipperary from a very proud equine industry, and indeed all over the country. But as I said, I was speaking to the Minister, and you confirmed in the parliamentary reply to me that the Department of Agriculture had given authorities £4.5 million to deal with seizure and control of horses in the 3-year period from 2014 to 2017. And it's absolutely staggering to see the industrial scale removal, seizure and killing of horses that local authorities have been engaged in for over killing humanely now. During that period, just under 25,000 horses were seized, with 16,971 of them subsequently being euthanised. So, I mean, what's going on? Why are this cohort of people exempt from all the rules? And why aren't the people here, this motion, concerned about that? And it's not farmers, that's maybe a very odd one, but it's not farmers, I've said, maybe 0.0% of them that are. And there's a group that are abusing these horses for sulky racing and for everything else, and leave them dead on the road, and danger to the public and health and safety. And I had a case where a wonderful animal refuge took a horse out of the bog, out of Littleton bog, a horse who had lost the foal, brought him into the refuge, nurtured him and still nurturing him back to health, and now they're being ordered to give back the horse to the person who owned the horse. A criminal gang that had brought that horse all over the world, from Ireland to England to America and back again, full circle. And that's the kind of support they're getting with a paltry bit of money from the department, those volunteers from the Animal Refuge. As regards the coursing and the Clonmel Coursing Festival, 100% I supported. And as regards the coursing clubs, who do wonderful work in the habitats to keep the stocks of healthy hares and everything else. And as regards the people who come and protest and cut the wires that have out of the refuge across the motorway to be slaughtered by trucks, I think that speaks for itself. The people who came again, Animal Welfare Group, that's put glass on the tracks, broken glass, to rip up the greyhounds' hands, is that animal welfare? And again, these people didn't get freedom to speech. But we had a group of people here last week, women hurt by abortion, they weren't even allowed to speak in hotels around here, protested. So we have a very funny thinking here of freedom of speech and who we look after and who we don't.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle, and I'd like to start by complimenting Deputy O'Sullivan, who, like her predecessor, Deputy Tony Gregory, has really been to the forefront in this state in raising issues of animal health and welfare, and I very much salute her in that regard. And I also want to acknowledge those who are present in the gallery from all the multitude of groups around this state, many of whom have travelled very long distances to be with us tonight. They're by and large volunteers, people who do it for no other reason but love of animals, and it's their expertise and their experience which says that the regulations and the legislation which we have in place at the moment, despite maybe the best intentions of those who brought it in, simply are not working. I'm quite sure they've much better things to be doing with their lives than being in here, but they're here to say that we need to change and that we're not doing enough. I think I want to start by saying let's step back and look at this. Man's inhumanity to man is often mirrored in our mistreatment of animals. As far as I'm concerned, it's a consequence of a society which commodifies animals for human profit. It's as simple as that. I was fully expecting somebody to get up and say, oh sure, look, there's far more important issues out there. Why are we wasting our time on this? I think it's illustrative that nobody did say that. I think that gives an indication of how animal welfare is a very serious issue, which everybody acknowledges. And there's a couple of reasons for it. I think, firstly, a society which is cruel to animals is symptomatic of a deeper malaise that exists and extends to a mistreatment of other vulnerable groups in society. It's also scientifically demonstrated that those who exploit and demonstrate wanton and gratuitous cruelty towards animals often end up displaying similar features towards their fellow human beings. So we in Independence for Change make no apology for raising animal welfare and indeed animal rights issues, and we will continue to do that. I very much welcome Maureen's motion as an animal lover, as a vegetarian, as someone who moved the first motion on a county council 10 years ago now to prohibit the use of wild animals in circuses, and it's an awful indictment that still hasn't been sorted out 10 years on. I think the motion is a very timely reminder of the cruelty that goes on. I think it's also a very straightforward motion. Its intent is to raise the standards of animal welfare and protection in this country. not just domestic animals, animals in captivity, animals in the wild, those being bred for sport, even despicably blood sports, those that are being used for experiments or being bred for their fur or indeed for their meat. And, you know, we could literally be here all night talking about any one aspect of those. There is no end to the cruelty that is demonstrated, and I can't deal with all of the issues. But let's for a minute look at the issues of the use of animals in farming and the use of animals in sport, which in many ways could be viewed as legitimate cruelty, or people who would be absolutely horrified to hear of a story of a gurrier throwing a cat onto a bonfire has no problem with some of the exploitation that goes on in those spheres. And I don't say that lightly or to be critical to those people, but we as a society have to step back and look at those issues. Deputy Fitzmaurice said farmers love their animals. I accept that. Of course farmers love their animals. It's their means to their livelihood. Did people in Ireland years ago love their children? When they sent them to Magdalen laundries because they were pregnant outside marriage, when they slapped them for being bold in school. Society changes and evolves, and we have different standards of culture and society addressing matters when we learn more as a society. And in that sense, it's not a question of slagging off farmers, but we do need to step back and look at how we use animals. Now, I can say it, you know, confidently, I suppose, because I am a vegetarian. But there's no economic or environmental sense in eating meat. And it's interesting that Deputy Healy-Rae, who didn't bother to stay, has raised issues because he denies climate change. But there's no doubt about it. The amount of cattle that's been raised now is a huge contributing factor to climate change and emissions and so on. And we as a society are going to have to address that. It's also the case that the misuse of animals in what we call sport. Is it true that horses, when they're gainfully employed in our studs or whatever, are treated like royalty? The examples given by others, that they have a better set-up than homeless people. Yes, they do when they're productively employed, but when they're not, tough. And then the issues of drugs and all the rest as well is very much part of that. And we are saying, and in fairness, we said it to Minister Coveney at the time, that the Animal Health and Welfare Bill was good on paper. We suspected at the time that it would have limitations, and sadly this has proven to be the case. I would say the profile around issues of cruelty has been raised. We've had a number of interactions since the passing of the bill with members of An Garda Síochána who have tried to deal with issues of animal cruelty. In the main, I found them to respond very well to try and address the issues, but they haven't really been given the legislation to equip them to do that effectively. And, you know, I would like deputies to have a think about it in the way in which John Fitzgerald, in a letter to the papers, asked them today. I mean, those who give out and sort of correctly are appalled by, you know, animals found dead and starving on the sides of roads, or cats being shot with pellet guns or being thrown into fires, or dogs found with their ears hacked off and so on. And then you think it's okay that hair coursing's all right. I mean, a hunted fox or a coursed hare feels pain in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter to him that the person chasing him has a nice suit and a lot of money in his pocket. Is that any different to a death experienced by somebody who might throw you on a bonfire in an estate in Dublin? They don't suffer any less, and I would, without in any way being flippant, ask deputies to stand back and look at that certain double standards that exists. We often hear people who are horrified about greyhounds and how they're treated in other countries, but we've no problem in shipping there. And I put it to Deputy Fitzmaurice, if you sell a car to somebody who you know has been guilty of joyriding and killing people, then as far as I'm concerned you are responsible. And the analogy is exactly the same. So we wanted, in putting this motion forward, to challenge some of those views. Other deputies have made the point about the ISPCA, the amount of calls they've received, 16,000 calls last year. It shows how much citizens are engaged trying to deal with these issues. But 16 cases finalised in the court, and even at that the penalties imposed have been ridiculously low. And I want to look at that. I have no time. Deputy O'Sullivan dealt with issues of badger culling and so on, but I just want to briefly deal with the issue of badger baiting, which is patently illegal in this state. And as we're here tonight, it is going on. And it's absolutely reprehensible, cruel, inhumane activity, which involves the invasion of a badger's habitat by trained terriers who drag out the badger, usually grown men who organise this horror show. There's a picture of one of them here with his balaclava and his military gear. I wouldn't like to cross him. I'm sure our NEPS officers and that certainly wouldn't like to cross him either. Generally, they pull out mother badgers who've recently given birth because their instinct is to protect their young, and they'll get a far better fight out of her as she fights for her life and to protect her cubs. And meanwhile, they stand around and they place bets on that activity. 30 years ago, Panorama highlighted what was going on in Ireland, a tourism in that type of barbarity. And today, 30 years on, it's still going on, with gangs in the Midland operating, criminal gangs, who in 2013 were arrested over incidents of badger baiting. In the 2 years before they were brought to court, they managed to polish and bring out an entirely professional operation, operating on Facebook, tracking badgers with GPS systems and a network of betting and appalling videos going on. So by the time they came to court in 2015 and got their 3-month suspended sentence, the lads said, good luck. 5 people with a 3-month suspended sentence and went off to hone their badger baiting skills, which undoubtedly they're probably at tonight. And even Googling the internet will introduce you to some of their activities. So a patently illegal activity which our NEPS officers and our Gardaí are aware of and have tried to deal with. But God Almighty, what NEPS officer without a gun or an armoured car is going to go in and take on some of these thugs? They're not going to be able to deal with that. We need a lot more if you like, support for our NEPS officers and for our Gardaí in dealing with these activities. We don't have time, Ceann Comhairle. The fact that so many dogs are even bred to spend their lives participating in these blood sports is the other side of the equation, not to mind puppy farm and all the other barbarity that goes on. We will be continuing to raise these issues. It's clear the legislation is deficient, and I think the efforts of NGOs and people in the gallery to highlight these is very a positive aspect of those citizens, and one that we will certainly attempt to ape and copy.
Thank you, Deputy Daly, and I call Minister Creed to respond. Minister.
Last Ceann Comhairle, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this debate and have listened attentively to all of the contributions, and I would like to commend Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan and our colleagues for tabling the motion. I think as we gather here on the eve of World Animal Welfare Day, I think actually if you consider the debate in all its context, there's actually more that unites us than divides us. And I think that's a positive step. There are issues probably on the extremes that we will probably never agree on. But I want to make a couple of points from the Department of Agriculture perspective. Anybody who breaks the law in respect of animal welfare issues will find no favour or no place to hide in the context of the Department of Agriculture. And we do that for many reasons. I was interested in Deputy Kinney's contribution, who made the point about we couldn't have a proper animal welfare system because our farming system was driven by profit. I'd ask you, Deputy Kinney, to consider, what if our farming is driven by poverty? What are the consequences for animal welfare? I would suggest to you that they're far, far more serious. So we have a regulatory, legislative framework to deal with animal welfare abuses. I listened last night to Michael Gove, who was my counterpart in the UK government speaking at the Tory party conference, who was making the point that they need to urgently update their animal welfare legislation. My predecessor, Deputy Coveney, did that in 2013, when we were updating legislation that went back prior to the foundation of the state. And we now have regulations and law fit for purpose. And a combination of my department, voluntary bodies and charitable bodies working as designated officers under the legislation, local authorities, Parks and Wildlife, the Gardaí. I think that legislation is by and large fit for purpose. And there have been a substantial number of prosecutions, both prosecutions at a central level by my department, but also prosecutions at various stages along the line by local Department of Agriculture officials, prosecutions by the Gardaí, prosecutions by dedicated officers appointed under the legislation. So I think by and large we have the regulatory and legislative framework. You did make reference, Deputy O'Sullivan, to Ballinasloe and incidents which were apparently highlighted there of concern in the areas. I think the very fact that there are designated officers there and identifying and following up on concerns in the area of animal welfare is actually proof in a way that our legislation is fit for purpose. Now, I suppose there will, because we are identifying cases, does that prove that our system isn't working? Because we're having prosecutions, does it prove that our system is working? Or does it prove that we are effective in dealing with these incidents as they arise? That is the challenge. I mean, are we ahead of the game? Are we in control of it? Or are we playing catch-up? And I would certainly say there's no cause whatsoever for complacency here. And I come back to the point raised by Deputy Kinney. For even commercial self-interest, it's in this country's financial interest to have the highest animal welfare standards. I have the privilege of being the Minister for Agriculture, Food and Marine, and I currently attend on a number of occasions international trade fairs and trade missions to promote Ireland as the food island. And that food island, bearing in mind that not everybody where we sell our food are vegetarians, it involves all our meat and dairy products, and increasingly it is taken almost for granted and as a given that we produce safe, traceable, nutritious food. But increasingly the ask in the markets where we want to be, the higher value-added markets, is what are our animal welfare standards and what are our sustainability credentials? And this comes to the point that Deputy Daly made about sustainability and greenhouse gases and cattle rearing systems wearing a vegetarian badge of honour. It is not so often recognised that we are the most carbon efficient producers of dairy products in the world. Now, if we dismantle our dairy systems on some altar in the context of climate change, and I'm not a climate change denier, in fact I think though we are global leaders in the dairy side we need to do more, but if we dismantle our dairy industry, it is only going to be displaced by other countries which have a higher carbon footprint. And this is equally the case in terms of the beef industry. And we're facing challenges in the context of European Union and beef industry access to our markets from Mercosur countries. We are the 5th most carbon efficient producer of beef in the European Union and are committed to doing more in that space. But if we sacrifice our industry, it will be displaced by countries, because we are the largest producer of beef and exporter of beef in the Northern Hemisphere. It will be displaced by countries that produce it at a far higher carbon footprint. So, yes, it is 33% of our global greenhouse gas emissions, but that's because we don't have a history of heavy industry that other industrialised countries have. We are reducing the carbon intensity, and I think that in itself is a signal of our commitment. Ireland, as I said, has a good record when it comes to caring for its animals. Unfortunately, instances of cruelty do occur. There has been significant progress in updating animal welfare legislation, in particular with the introduction of the Animal Health and Welfare Act 2013, which provides for significant custodial sentences, up to 5 years in certain circumstances, and very substantial fines. And that, I think, is the toolkit that we use. And that's in worst-case circumstances. In other instances, we will need to work with people to make sure that they address shortcomings. But by and large, we are taking a significant number of prosecutions, and that's by and large due to the efforts in improving that legislation by my predecessor. Enforcement has been enhanced by a provision in the Act that allows some investigative powers to be granted to members of NGOs, and as an instance, some of those were present in Ballinasloe, authorised officers under the legislation. My department has been operating this an animal welfare hotline since 2012, which facilitates confidential reporting of any suspicion of animal cruelty, whether in farming, sport, recreational or domestic situations. And I would urge members of the public to continue to use this as a means of drawing my department's attention to instances of neglect. And we will always follow up on those instances. I would like to note that the work of the Farm Animal Welfare Advisory Council, this is an independent advisory body to my department, which identifies potential welfare cases before they arise on farms through its early warning intervention system for animal welfare cases, which operates at both national and county level, and through which my department has developed a very strong partnership with the IFA and reps from the various county SPCAs. I wish to reiterate the comments of Minister Doyle in acknowledging the contribution of the animal welfare charities. The staff and volunteers in these organisations demonstrate commitment, professionalism and dedication in providing care and happy endings to abandoned and cruelly treated animals. Last December, I provided €2.46 million to 137 animal welfare organisations, and I will be making further awards, merited awards, to these organisations who do invaluable work. The cumulative total that we have given since 2011 is over €11.26 million. I would wish we were in a position to give more, because I do acknowledge that very often these charitable organisations who are out on the ground are able to do more effectively what the state probably could never replicate, and I do salute their commitment and their professionalism. I would like also to acknowledge the work being carried out by some welfare bodies in conjunction with local authorities and with financial support from my department to develop facilities for urban and traveller horse populations. And I was out with Deputy Kinney, and what you did fail to mention, I'm sure, an oversight, is that that project in Clondalkin was funded to the tune of £500,000 by, or €500,000 by the Department of Agriculture, as a recognition of the role it plays in education. I think by and large is the fundamental thing, but also in addressing, the fitting and rightful recognition of the urban horse in the overall recognition of our equine sector in particular, which has come through, I think, a particularly difficult period. But I would associate a lot of the animal welfare and particularly equine welfare issues that have arisen in most recent years to be a consequence of the crash, and not the profit but the poverty associated with the crash, Deputy Kinney. There were a number of other points which were raised. Deputy Healy-Rae, I think the greyhound industry, Deputy Minister Doyle has addressed the need to address in a comprehensive fashion the concerns of the punters out there in terms of integrity in the greyhound racing industry, and that's part of the new legislative framework that we will put in place. Deputy Kinney spoke about the dog, the domestic dog. And in fact, Deputy Doyle and I both, Deputy Doyle turned to show me a picture on his screensaver, which is a picture of his family dog, and by coincidence, my screensaver is a picture of my family dog. And I think it sums up in a way the position, the special position of the dog in our affection to animal welfare at the highest level. And I do accept that, the puppy farming issue is a stain on that, and it's something that the Department of the Environment has been in consultation with, and there is a commitment to looking at the regulations underpinning that, because I think that's an area where, in particular, we need additional focus. But I do conclude on this. Sincere thanks to Deputy O'Sullivan. I think there is more unites us in this debate than divides us. And thank you.
And I call Deputy Joan Collins.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm taking 5 minutes. First of all, I'd like to again commend Deputy O'Sullivan for presenting this private member's bill this evening, and to say I was delighted to sign up to it with the Independents for Change. I welcome the NGOs and volunteers and activists in the gallery. I think it reflects the interest and concern people have in animal welfare and health. Minister, there's an expression that a society is judged by how it treats and supports and protects the vulnerable in society. I also believe that society should be judged by how it treats and respects animals who are vulnerable and who are in the care of society. Now, I have serious questions on how the government has responded to the housing crisis, where we have 3,000 children in homes, in hotels and the hostels. And I also think, as an opposition TD, that we should also challenge the government's policy on the animal health and welfare bill that was introduced. In relation to hare coursing, it's already been mentioned about the coursing trials that were taking place there in September, where the amount of 130 trials were taking place, but using only 64 hares. That's against the Animal Health and Welfare Bill. We know of people taking the hares as they're released after coursing and then collected and sold back again in the interest of profit there as well. So we know there's in many areas where in the hare coursing that there is serious problems and people using or breaking the Animal Welfare Bill itself. And I think that if the government deems hare coursing worthy of licensing, we maintain it should be consistent and ensure that all coursing fixtures and all coursing are subject to MP, National Park and Wildlife Services monitoring. When monitors are not present, coursing clubs will and have shown repeatedly over the years be tempted to act in breach of the licence conditions. If the state lacks the manpower or the commitment to monitor all of these animal baiting events, it should stop licensing them and simply outlaw hare coursing, an option favoured by the majority of Irish people, according to opinion polls. I want to take up the point about animals being exported from Ireland. The Guardian did a very detailed examination of this back in May 2017, this year, where it showed evidence of animals who had been exported, been cruelly treated from the point of view of the welfare. It wasn't criticising the fact that the animals were being exported and how they were exported on the ships. It was where they ended up, often outside of European laws, and how they were treated. Absolutely disgusting in relation to their throats being slit, animals being hung by one leg and slaughtered while they were alive. Some of the conditions they were in relation to no water, food, and conditions in the transport of these animals. And I think what we want to hear, and what people that are concerned about animal welfare, is that there's absolutely real transparency that any country where animals are being exported, that they should be very clear that those animal welfare legislation in those countries is of high quality as well, and that wherever those animals are being transported to, that they should be respected in the same way as they would be respected here, even though there's a huge question mark about how we actually use animals. The last point I want to make is in relation to the ISPCA. We've been contacted by the ISPCA. They say that they welcome, and as we welcome the bill that came in 2014. But what they're saying is that the prosecutions themselves are too little. They don't serve to actually create a deterrent to those who are cruel to animals. Up to €5,000 is the fine in relation to cases dealt by the District Court, up to 6 months imprisonment, or in the Circuit Court it's up to €250,000, up to 5 years. Now, the report there, the 2016 report of the ISPCA, gives a few examples of the case that went to court. All of them fined 500 in order to pay 750 in costs, fined 500 disqualified. Only one case disqualified for keeping dogs for 2 years. And what should be done, Minister, that anybody who's prosecuted in the courts in relation to cruelty for animals, they should, every single them should be attached with disqualification for keeping animals for at least 5 years. It should be not a maximum of 5,000. It should be probably a minimum of 4,000 or 5,000 euro for people who are found to be cruel to animals. Some of the cruelty that these animals, that the ISPCA dealt with, is absolutely horrific, and these people shouldn't be allowed keep animals in any shape or form over the next period of time. They want more resources. They want more officers on the ground. That should be done. If you can't implement that, if you can't provide that, well, then it's making a mockery of that legislation. I really think that the Minister should deal with that and maybe come back in relation to how you intend to increase the amount of officers in that area to deal with the issues.
Deputy O'Sullivan, to conclude, has 5 minutes.
So, dús ahantas agus buíochas de gacéine Clockpart san dísport. I really appreciate all the contributions tonight. The point is that we can't dispute the facts and the evidence of animal neglect and animal cruelty, because there are gaps in the legislation and because the legislation is not being fully implemented. And it doesn't help that there are 3 departments involved in animal issues. It doesn't help that there's no consistency in the way councils apply the DBE Act and guidelines and the Animal Welfare Act. For example, a breeder was found to have more than the specified number of dogs. Now, instead of the council prosecuting him, the council just upped the number of dogs that he could have. It doesn't help that there are repeated refusals by certain councils to release inspection records. And it doesn't help the levels of secrecy and the difficulties that animal welfare supporters have in getting information, including through FOIs, of inspections that have been carried out by local authorities. And when they do get that information, it can be very heavily redacted. If there's nothing to hide, the information should be readily available. And it doesn't help that there are authorities who choose to do nothing when cases of animal neglect and abuse are brought to their attention by individuals and groups, and then those authorities spend their time justifying inaction and they close ranks in order to protect their own. Now, we have many responsible, hard-working vets, include my own over in Fairview on that one, but there appears to be no one to follow up on those vets who are not enforcing the animal welfare legislation. And I have to ask, what is the role of the Veterinary Council of Ireland on the statutory obligations of their members? The VCI can undertake investigations if concerns are raised, and they could make the industry substantially better. Now, I had a look at the amendments, and the Fianna Fáil amendment sets out the theory in legislation to ensure highest standards and strict sanctioning regime for offenders. And the government amendment also mentions increased penalties, but that is not happening, as Deputy Connells has just pointed out there. We are way behind other countries. For example, the UK have increased sentencing for people convicted of animal cruelty, and in the US, animal cruelty is now a Class A felony, with the FBI tracking animal cruelty issues. Yes, the amendment about the line about live exports may have a veterinary health cert when they're leaving Ireland, but look at what happens to them en route and on arrival at destination. And there are evidence and facts to prove this. Yes, welfare checks are carried out, but the reports are not always available, as I said, and we don't see the follow-up. Yes, the 2.4 million, and it's good to hear you giving more to animal charities, but in 2017, 64 million was given to the greyhound and horse industry, and it's the animal welfare charities who have to deal with the fallout of unwanted dogs and horses. And Minister, you might clarify if the Cavan puppy farmer who kept whelping bitches and unborn pups in the tiny wooden crates that are illegal under the guidelines is on the working group reviewing the DBE guidelines. And you might also ask Cavan County Council who is representing them on the working group, because they refuse to disclose that information as to who it is. And then also, you could clarify the self-confessed biggest puppy farmer in Europe who is still operating, even though a closure order was sought because of the appalling conditions in which he was keeping the animals. My understanding is he's still operating with no planning permission, but with the full knowledge of Offaly County Council, who won't issue enforcement proceedings. Now, if a person is neglected or abused or badly treated, that person has a voice. But animals don't have a voice. And so to the people in the gallery and others who can't be here tonight, only for you and others like you, Ireland's reputation on animal welfare would be much, much worse. So I thank you for your care, your passion, your commitment to expose and eliminate animal neglect and cruelty. The one positive tonight, is that we all agree that cruelty to animals is unacceptable and won't be tolerated. So I take that positive from tonight, and it is good to hear members talk about their love for animals. But we can't just rest there on the words and what is on paper, because there are too many documented cases of animal neglect and outright cruelty. And if we have so much in common, well, then we most certainly can make a difference on this matter. Thank you.
I'm obliged to put the question, and that's amendment number 2 in the name of the Minister. The question is that the amendment be made. It should the Tana Wawer Abadis Ta, it should the Tana Gunya Abadis Neil, Shilam Goal and Cash Richa. The division is postponed until the weekly division time on Thursday in accordance with Standing Order 72. Gormaigav agus tan dalar atlug G Manley Amara. Gormaigav.